California task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Content warning. It contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. Contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
The Moynihan Report. Developments in the past half-century have been as impactful, or arguably as harmful, to America's perception of black families as the Moynihan Report of 1965. And content of the Moynihan Report. In the midst of the civil rights movement, in 1965, Daniel Moynihan, an assistant secretary of labor researching policies as part of the Johnson administration's War on Poverty, drafted what was originally an internal Department of Labor report entitled The Negro Family for National Action. 156 as described in the introduction of the report. One of its goals was to analyze the African American family structure, which Moynihan saw as the fundamental problem underlying the gap in income, standards of living, and education between African Americans and other groups. 157 The report described numerous ways that the historical legacy of slavery and institutional racism created lasting, harmful effects on African Americans and the black family. 58 However, while acknowledging the impacts of these historical realities, essentially claimed that the high rate of single motherhood in black families in America was a major reason for the continued failure of African Americans to achieve full and equal access to success in America. 159 It further asserted that such equality could only be achieved by changing the culture of African Americans, and particularly of black men, who Moynihan claimed had been feminized and rendered inadequate workers through being raised without male role models. 60 Even when advocating for governmental intervention to assist African Americans, the Moynihan Report still portrayed them as helpless but for the intervention of white Americans. Describing what Moynihan called the pathology of black America as capable of perpetuating itself without assistance from the white world. 161 Although the Moynihan Report relied heavily on scholarship previously published by black scholars, and linked the poverty experienced by African Americans to the historical traumas of slavery, it also argued that the Civil Rights Act and equality of opportunity would not resolve them. 162 The Moynihan Report asserted that the gap between the Negro and other groups in American society is widening. The problem, in which this is most clearly the case, is that of family structure. 63 Moynihan argued, for example, that the prevalence of single motherhood in black families created a matriarchal structure which seriously retards the progress of the group as a whole. 164 Sexism and gender stereotyping of the report also dovetailed with existing hostility towards black women serving as leaders in the civil rights movement. 65 Contemporary black women leaders were outraged that Moynihan explicitly advocated for improved governmental job opportunities for black men over black women to ensure male breadwinners. 166 Trailblazing advocate Pauli Murray stated that Moynihan's criticism of black women in the workforce was bitterly ironic, as criticism for their efforts to overcome a handicap not of their own making. 167 Murray and others sharply disputed that traditional gender roles could solve black poverty and racism. 68 Social scientist Donna Franklin argued that the family instability Moynihan focused on was mostly a result of the fact that black women were hired as maids and child caregivers, while racial discrimination prevented black men from finding jobs. 169 W. E. B. Du Bois made a similar observation nearly a half a century before the Moynihan Report. 170 Franklin also noted that the many single mothers in the black community noted by Moynihan was at least partially due to the fact that adoption services did not accept black children. 171 As a result, single black women were forced into motherhood when white women had the option of giving their children up for adoption. 172 During the 1950s, 70% of white single mothers gave up their children for adoption, but only 5% or fewer of black single mothers did so. 173 As Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote, the report helped create the myth that fatherhood is the great antidote to all that ails black people. 74 No national effort resulted from the Moynihan Report. President Johnson called for a White House conference in its wake, which occurred in November of 1965. 75 At that point, the report had engendered so much controversy that Moynihan himself was largely sidelined at the conference, having recently left the administration. 76. Temporary response of black leaders to the Moynihan report. Response to the Moynihan report. President Johnson acknowledged the legacy of state-sanctioned slavery and discrimination when he publicly stated, "Negro poverty is not white poverty." 77 Nevertheless, his administration followed that announcement with few meaningful efforts to address disparities of African Americans. 78 Johnson did, however, convene a group of well-respected civil rights leaders to address black poverty, which produced a report proposing that the federal government spend billions of dollars to ensure jobs, universal health insurance, and a basic minimum income paid to all Americans, regardless of race. 79 Their approach did not acknowledge that the American government has harmed African Americans in a unique way, since they believed proposals aimed at helping all poor Americans, black and white, were likely to succeed. 80 Nevertheless, very few of their recommendations ultimately manifested in any federal legislation from the Johnson administration, or otherwise. 181. On public discourse and social policy scholars have consistently criticized the Moynihan report for blaming the victim. 182 For some politicians and government actors, the Moynihan report justified a stance that African Americans were unworthy of public assistance because black culture was to blame for harms resulting from the enslavement and racial discrimination. 83. Moynihan also suggested that every young black man should join the armed forces, which would provide black men with a much-needed world away from women, a world run by strong men of unquestioned authority, where discipline, if harsh, is nonetheless orderly and predictable. 184 This recommendation was made as American involvement in the Vietnam War was beginning to escalate, at a time in which black men were underrepresented in the armed forces. 85 Moynihan's analysis and recommendation lead to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara's Project 100,000, a program ostensibly designed to allow greater access to the U.S. military for those who initially failed the qualifications test. 186 Project 100,000 ultimately served as a successful recruitment tool for black soldiers in the Vietnam War. 40% of those recruited were black, a proportion nearly 4 times the percentage of African Americans in the general population. 87 Regardless, black men were more likely to be drafted than white men, further devastating black families when thousands of black men died in the war. 188. Moynihan report and its central conclusions were immediately controversial and contested. Johnson adopted its language and central focus in decrying the breakdown of the Negro family structure as fundamental to the challenges faced by African Americans. 189 Several high-profile scholars also used the conclusions of the Moynihan report to argue against the very social welfare programs for which Moynihan had advocated to help African Americans out of poverty. Included Arthur Jensen and Charles Murray, best known for their deeply controversial book, The Bell Curve, who argued that the wealth gap between black and white Americans existed because white Americans were more intelligent, a position Moynihan explicitly rejected. 90. Scholars argued the Moynihan report provided grounds for politicians to blame black single-parent families for their poverty and to deny assistance to African Americans in need. 191 Scholars have noted that Ronald Reagan, as California governor, exploited the perception of the single black mother popularized by the Moynihan report when he coined the term welfare queen as part of his larger campaign for limited government. 92 Historians have argued that the Moynihan report, despite arguing for greater interventions to combat black poverty, less influenced the political movement within the federal government in the 1990s to cut welfare programs and impose punitive welfare to work, training or employment requirements on recipients of cash assistance.